Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's discussion on women in politics, positions of leadership. I'm Iysha Arun from the Dialogue Society, and I'll be moderating our session this evening. We're fortunate to be joined by a well-informed and knowledgeable panel today, most notably Professor Rosie Campbell from King's College London, and Dr. Meryl Kenny from the University of Edinburgh, and Meghan Campbell from Birmingham University. So welcome to you all panelists. Thank you for being here with us today. The significance of today's topic, I think, is really illustrated with the fact that despite having the right to vote in the UK for over 100 years now, women still remain significantly underrepresented in all levels of politics. Within the House of Commons, for example, we're at the highest representation it's been, and that being at a mere 34%. So not to dishearten our audience online before we begin, as I'm sure we'll end on a constructive and empowering note, but there are a wide level of identified factors feeding into this underrepresentation, from the hostile media culture to an unequal gender norms within the system. So our objective from today really is to share some of the thinking about, firstly, these obstacles that women may face in female leadership roles within politics, and how we can pave perhaps a wider facilities and opportunities for participation. This being the first of our panel series on women empowerment, and the next two sessions being on women in academia and women in business, it's really excited that we've started on such a crucial topic of women in politics, which really is the kind of bed of our society, and where the most power is held within decision making. We're in course inviting our audience to interact throughout the event through the chat section. I'll try to incorporate comments and questions as we go along, as well as leaving some questions for the larger Q&A section at the end. And our panelists, of course, are free to ask questions and interact throughout the discussion. So without stealing much of our precious time this evening, I'd like to pass the microphone on to our first speaker, Professor Rosie Campbell, who is the Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. She's a Professor of Politics and has written extensively on the barriers to participation of politics, and recently on gendered patterns of support for populist radical right. Her research interests include the politics of diversity and political recruitment. Professor Campbell, the floor is yours.
Hi everybody, nice to be joining you. I shall make sure you can see my whole head. So I just had a couple of quick slides, which I imagine won't be telling you anything you don't know, but I thought it might be useful to have some data in front of us to inform the conversation. So just starting off, here's a graph that shows the percentage of women and men elected to the House of Commons between 1918 and 2019. What you can see there is a lot of grey, and it gets considerably better as you move on. From 1997, we see this tipping point where suddenly the proportion of women in the House of Commons doubles overnight. And of course, that's the election of New Labour. And New Labour had used positive discrimination in the form of a women shortlist to guarantee that women would be selected in at least half of their retirement and winnable seats. So that's when we really see a tipping point and change happening, and we see growth over time to get to the 34% in 2019. But this is by no means an inevitable progression that has happened. Just looking at these numbers, I think without the intervention of the Labour Party in 97, we might have expected some continual growth, but you might imagine a trajectory that takes us to less than half of the figure that we're at now. Well, why do I say that? Well, if you look at the proportion of women MPs by party over time, and here I've just compared 2005 to 2019, you can see the significant difference in party breakdown of the proportion of women MPs. So in 2019, for the first time, we have got the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats having a higher proportion of women MPs than men MPs in the House of Commons, which is incredible transformation over time. And you can see that the Conservatives have really increased the representation of women on their benches from 9% in 2005 to 24%. So that is a considerable improvement, but it is a long way off, less than half of the Labour Party percentage. And that is because the Conservative Party has used a lot of measures to try and make their recruitment processes more meritocratic, but they haven't used all women shortlists. And in fact, in some seats, because they have a very active organisation in Women to Win inside the Conservative Party, there really has been behind the scenes very serious lobbying to try and have informal all-women shortlists and to really push this forward. So there's also a lot that we can't see in terms of decisions that have been made behind the scenes. So this is why there is no inevitable progress, where we see that the huge amount of the change has been driven by the Labour Party, which has used all-women shortlists in those elections, with one election where they were unable to over that time. And if we think about the representation of ethnic minority women MPs, we also now have 36 women from visible ethnic minority backgrounds in the House of Commons, which is an unbelievable transformation in the position that we were at before, in that ethnic minority MPs now make up 1 in 10 members of the House of Commons, and 35 of those 65 MPs are women. So again, we see real progress, we see reasons for optimism, but there is still a long way to go. If you look back to my previous slide, for women to be at 50%, we've got more work to do. So moving on to what might the barriers be to getting equal representation of women in politics? Well, one of the reasons I think that we still need positive discrimination measures such as women shortlists is there isn't a level playing field, particularly in our two-party, first past the post electoral system that operates at parliamentary Westminster elections. There is a lot of room for bias to slip into the process. If each individual constituency is choosing one candidate, if that one candidate just turns out to be a man every time, the constituencies can say, oh, well, that's just the way it happened, rather than systematically identifying that there is bias in the process. Another reason is harassment and intimidation of candidates. I'm the principal investigator of the Representative Audit of Britain, which is a survey of all candidates who stood in the 2015, 2017 and 2019 elections. Our 2019 post-election wave of the survey is still being administered. We were rather delayed by COVID, so I can't give you the 2019 data, but this is the 2017 data. And you can see that women were more likely to say that they had experienced some kind of harassment than men by 8 percentage points. Women were also more likely to report that they were fearful as a result of that harassment. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar of the research that has looked at the interaction between gender and ethnicity and harassment. And unfortunately, some very important work by Amnesty International shows that ethnic minority women MPs are much more likely to be the target of online abuse and harassment than white women MPs. So this is an area where, if anything, the situation is perhaps deteriorating rather than progressing, and an area where we need to take action if we're going to keep pushing up the numbers of women in politics. Finally, I think this is perhaps a cause for optimism. I know it's a little bit small. This is some research that I did with Professor Sarah Childs from Royal Holloway University of London. Oh, I should have said the previous slide is with Sophia Collinew. I think that's written there. I can't see it because you're in front of it, but hopefully that's there. So this is with Sarah Childs. And we, in 2013, we did a survey of all MPs in the House of Commons. And we backed it up by also doing online data dredging. And we were identifying what proportion of MPs had or didn't have children. We were able to get a complete data set for whether MPs had children or not, and a less complete data set for those MPs who did have children, the ages of those children and how many of them they had. And in 2013, we were quite shocked by the extent of the difference between men and women. So 45% of MPs, women MPs in 2013 had no children compared to 28% of men. So even though there were more women were entering politics, those women were less typical of women in society and men in society in that they were less likely to have children. And of course that makes perfect sense. Parliament has been an incredibly inhospitable place for people with caring responsibilities. The fact is that it's only very recently in recent campaigns that there's been any real consideration of baby leave, ability to take babies into the chamber. When you think about the difficulties of combining two residences and potentially if you don't have a constituency close to Westminster, all of those impacts mean that actually the women who did get through were sometimes less likely to have children. And this varied substantially by cohort. We found that of those MPs who'd been elected between 1959 and 1996, the gap between men and women was larger. So we reran the survey again in 2017, and we're really pleased to see the gap had narrowed. So in 2017, 39% of women MPs compared to 30% of men had no children. And if we looked down into those MPs who'd been elected between 2010 and 2015, the gap was just 2 percentage points, 32% of men and 34% of women. And if we looked at those elected in 2017, 43% of men and 39% of women. So it could be that some of these men will go on to have children and that the women may not. So the figures might change slightly, but they're unlikely to change dramatically. And so I think this should give us a cause for optimism that some of the barriers to parents who are active carers becoming politicians do seem to be declining. Although the caveat is that on average men have 0.4 more children than women do in MPs. I'm just moving you all so I can see. And the average age of the eldest child for women when they first entered Parliament in the 2017 survey was 15 and 11 years old for men, which is an argument for thinking about how a parliamentary career unfolds and ensuring that we also think about women who are later on in the life's course and their access to politics and to Parliament. And those are the main points that I wanted to raise, so I will pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor Campbell, for highlighting, both an oversight in terms of how far we've come in terms of the party dynamics as well, and the significance of having positive discrimination and the fact that those measures and forms need to be there to kind of overcome the systemic bias in place, and also highlighting some of those factors which can contribute to that too. So thank you very much for your contributions. Now we're on to our second speaker, Dr. Meryl Kenny, a senior lecturer is a member of the cross-party Women 50/50 campaign for legal gender quotas in Scotland. Her research areas lay in gender and politics, specifically political recruitment. So Dr. Kenny, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and also to Professor Campbell for giving us that really excellent overview of what the situation is in terms of women's underrepresentation. I'm going to focus a bit more on gender and political leadership and those dynamics. And this draws on a piece I've written recently with Amelia Belknap and Laura Shaw. But I think it's a really interesting time, and this is a very timely event to talk about political leadership, given, especially during the COVID pandemic, that we've had lots of media and headline attention devoted to this question of whether women leaders in particularly have been seen to be initially tackling the pandemic most effectively, right? So countries like Germany and Taiwan and New Zealand, especially Finland, Iceland, these are countries led by women. We had lots of columnists speculating, devoted to speculations that this is because women leaders are naturally more compassionate or more deferential to expertise or cooler in a crisis. But that the kind of headline attention belies the underlying fact that globally women political leaders are few and far between, and that links to issues that Rosie discussed, because in most systems, particularly parliamentary systems, you will have had to come through party politics before you become a political leader. So the obstacles to women's representation more broadly also reflect some of the obstacles to political leadership. And that as of January, at the start of this year, only 20 countries had women heads of state or government, and that those gains have been sluggish over time, similar patterns in the sense of the number of women leaders worldwide has only slightly more than doubled since 2005. So I think also it's a really interesting time because we've had several leadership contests play out this year that initially looked very positive for gender representation. So happening right now, we had in the United States, the Democratic Party nomination contest, which fielded its most diverse range of presidential primary candidates in history, including the largest number of women ever, 6 women. And then when we flash forward, that also comes, I think it's important to say, off the back of a surge of women's political mobilization in the party, with Democratic women running for and getting elected to office across the country in record numbers in the previous midterm elections, including a record number of women of color. But when we flash forward to spring, I know it's hard to remember spring, but spring 2020, there were only 3 women left standing of that number, and that was Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, and Tulsi Gabbard. And by the end of Super Tuesday, these women had dropped out in large part. Gabbard followed a little bit later, and there were 2 men left standing, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And of course, Joe Biden eventually got the nomination, but that moves from a very diverse field to 2 white male septuagenarian career politicians. And there are certainly some encouraging signs, I think, with this selection of Kamala Harris as the first vice presidential Black and Asian American candidate and the 3rd woman vice presidential candidate. But contingent on the outcomes in a few weeks, no woman has ever served as president or vice president of the United States. In the UK, around similar timings, we had the battles to succeed Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, which also raised hopes that Labour would finally elect its first woman leader. It has had acting women leaders. And again, this contradiction where Labour has long led on women's representation as parliamentary party, which Rosie highlighted, but hasn't had a woman leader. And again, that was something where by the final ballot, there were only 2 women candidates left, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Lisa Nandy. And Keir Starmer, of course, won with a majority of the vote. So in terms of obstacles and what those might tell us about gender and power and leadership more broadly, we have, when we talk about women in political leadership, we often talk about things like the glass ceiling or the kind of sticky floor and various metaphors to describe the kind of ongoing barriers to women's progression to the top. The glass cliff as well, which is a scenario that's been talked about a lot recently, especially where women are seen to take on the role of political leaders during times of crisis to clean up the mess, in part because men are seen to step away from a responsibility that's potentially destined for failure, and also that women leaders tend to have shorter tenures and be pushed off the cliff faster if they don't deliver once they get into power in these kind of more difficult situations. But also I think that ideas of who is a leader are highly gendered. They intersect with race, class, sexuality, disability, and other structures of power. That political leadership contests have historically been, amongst other things, struggles over masculinity, with leadership and power often described in masculine terms and associated with masculinized policy concerns, particularly around national security or terrorism or war. And we see a lot of that playing out in the current presidential contest in the US, both in the kind of gendered discourses around masks, which I think are very interesting, and the COVID pandemic, and how President Trump has positioned wearing masks as a sign of weakness. And that reflects wider findings around masculinity and the extent to which people adhere to mask wearing and other COVID policies. But also, for example, Joe Biden vowed at one point to beat Trump like a drum in the election. Fellow Democratic candidate who dropped out rather early on, Cory Booker, stated at one point that his testosterone sometimes made them feel like punching Trump. So we're not talking about very veiled messages here. So when women do decide to run for leadership positions, they have to contend with these gendered, racialized, classed perceptions about who is fit to lead. We saw that, I think, in the Labour leadership contest with some allegations around Rebecca Long-Bailey that she was a Corbyn puppet, that she was being led by male decision makers. And again, this was mentioned in the introduction, the kind of ongoing gendered and racialized abuse, and Rosie talked about this as well, the stereotyping and commentary that often targets women leaders, and particularly women of color, with attacks on their appearance, their speech, their motherhood or absence of children. And that women leadership candidates have to decide how to address these stereotypes, and they face a series of double binds that are under constant negotiation. So bodies versus brains, femininity versus competence, visibility versus invisibility, and that it's very hard to be considered both competent and likable as a female candidate. You are often one or the other, and everything you do to seem more competent means you're perceived as less likable, or to seem more likable means you're perceived as less competent. And I think what's really played out in the Democratic presidential contest as well is that women leaders have a much higher bar to cross. So women leaders have to demonstrate merit and experience and competence, but male candidates can exhibit potential. So we had Beto O'Rourke, for example, one of the presidential candidates, getting a very splashy cover story from Vanity Fair the day after he announces his presidential bid. And that same magazine 2 months earlier had run an article asking whether Elizabeth Warren, another candidate, was unlikable, right? So there's a difference in coverage there. There's also, I think, the question that comes up constantly, the question around electability, and that has gendered connotations. And so, for example, for Labour, with their leadership contest, some press debates and party debates focused on whether the priority was to pick a woman or to rebuild a party in a sustained electoral crisis. Now, of course, these priorities are not mutually exclusive, but they're presented as such in some circles. But overall, I think it's worth saying, and Rosie could certainly talk more about this in the discussion, that voter discrimination is not a major factor that limits women's election to public office. But that also means that while voters don't necessarily vote against candidates because they're women, they also don't necessarily vote for them because they're women. And certainly in the US, I think there would be some interesting things to watch in the next couple of weeks around particularly women's votes overall, where, for example, in 2016, Hillary Clinton got very strong support from women of color, but didn't win a majority of white women voters who voted for Donald Trump. So there are intersectional differences amongst women as well. So I think the last thing I just want to say before I stop is the question of why does it matter, and particularly why does it matter right now? And that's that we're looking ahead to turbulent times, some difficult times on the horizon. So it's all the more crucial than ever that women's voices are included at the top table, and that we've seen clear evidence of how the current pandemic has exacerbated gender and intersectional inequalities, racial disparities in the impact of COVID, the fact that women, and particularly women of color, are disproportionately concentrated in frontline healthcare jobs, but also low-wage jobs, as well as public sector jobs that might be more likely to be hit by the accompanying recession, increased reports of domestic violence during lockdown, the fact that gender inequalities in the home and the workplace are likely to widen, especially given impacts of school and nursery closures and increased care responsibilities. But I think we have to be careful not to overstate the impact of women political leaders, that they can have significant effects, but we shouldn't fall into essentialist arguments about women being naturally more compassionate or more collaborative, and that the relationship between women at the top and their ability to make a difference for other women is complex. And there's a variety of barriers that these women also face in terms of their ability to do things differently. I think there are some positive signs that again, that these issues are on the agenda. but we have to continue to question these inequalities because we're still a very, very long way from seeing equal representation at the top. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contributions. I think it's interesting to kind of really pick up on and kind of evaluate from the gendered perspective. I mean, as you mentioned as well, race and sexuality and disability also plays a role. But the way in which we observe or how the glass ceiling or the sticky floor, as you mentioned, play out really are kind of linked to these elements of intersectionality with the candidates, and also, you know, the double bind that you mentioned, the women being under a constant pressure, you know, to be competent and likable. I mean, it's contendable, of course, but we had Thatcher, for example, in the UK, who wasn't very liked, but is seen by as a success by many. And of course, she was kind of referred to and known by so-called, you know, masculine traits. So I think it's interesting how that's still continuing. And although women are making progress, like you said, in the US, for example, at the end, you know, it was the Democrat Party was left with 2 white males in the election process. So thank you very much. I'm sure there's a lot that we can kind of all bring together and discuss in the Q&A and discussion section at the end. Now we're on to our last speaker, final speaker, but of course, last but not least, Dr. Meghan Campbell from the University of Birmingham, who holds a position as a lecturer within the law department. Her research is in the field of human rights, gender equality, and public law. She's also provided written evidence for the Joint Committee on Human Rights and Women and Equalities Committee on Brexit. So Professor Campbell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think my presentation or my comments really build on nicely from Rosie and Meryl. So I want to look at what does it mean to have women's equality rights within Parliament? So building on Meryl and Rosie's discussion about like, how do we get women into positions of political leadership? What happens once they're in these institutions? Because these institutions have been built upon and modeled after and mirror men's life patterns and men's choices. And part of the aim is now, one of the great insights from equality law is that we've structured society to work well for certain privileged identity groups and not so well for other identity groups. And one of the aims of equality law is to dismantle those structures and rebuild or transform into structures that are more fair for everybody and reflect the multitude of life patterns and choices. So the aim is to create a gender sensitive Parliament. That's where equality law is taking us towards. And so then the question becomes, well, what does it mean to have a gender sensitive Parliament? What does it mean to dismantle this male dominated model and to create a legislative body that is fair and valorizes, not even just accommodates, but actually valorizes different life choices and patterns? And in thinking about what a gender sensitive Parliament looks like, it's important, I think, to remember to have 2 things that Parliament does simultaneously. It is a legislative body for governing the country. So it is really important that it reflects for political legitimacy more than just one type of voice, but it's also a workplace. It is a place where people go to do their job, and not just MPs, but there are clerks, there's admin staff, there's caterers, there's cleaners, there's a whole range of people who are employed in Parliament. And thus Parliament has to be equal, not just for sort of, in some ways, in some contexts, elite women who are MPs, but all types of women, younger, older, disabled, women of color, women with caring responsibilities, women with high incomes, women with low incomes. So in my sort of brief remarks, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of how we can make and engender Parliament to make it more equal for everybody who works within it. And that's looking at women with caring roles, that's looking at the language we use within Parliament, and then lastly, looking at sexual harassment at work, because Parliament is a workplace. So starting first with caring roles, it's actually quite surprising, but members of Parliament are not legally entitled to maternity leave. So if you are pregnant while you're an MP, you are not entitled to paid maternity leave, unlike other women or people who are pregnant who are in a formal employment relationship who are legally entitled to maternity leave. So one simple fix to make sure that women who are MPs and who become pregnant are treated equally within the institution is to make sure that they have maternity rights, to extend this sort of very, very basic, simple, women's equality rights to this subset of women who work within the political sphere. Another important thing to think about when thinking about women as mothers and women in caring roles in Parliament is to, when they're on maternity leave, they're still also MPs. They wear these two hats simultaneously. And some jurisdictions have talked about developing a system of proxy voting, so that when really important bills come to the floor while you're on maternity leave, like the internal market bill, basically any bill about Brexit or COVID these days, you can still participate in the voting system even though you're on maternity leave, because your political life doesn't end just because you become a mother. Another really important thing that can be a way to make parliaments more gender sensitive is that when women are returning to work from having children, returning to Parliament, they need to have spaces to express and safely store breast milk. I think Rosie also mentioned they should be able to bring in young children into Parliament. We need to recognize that people have identities that are not bifurcated between this is my caring life and this is my professional life. We are all these things at once, and we should respect that about each individual. Another thing parliaments should be 100% leading the way on is in shifting caring responsibilities. Right now, we all know that women disproportionately perform unpaid care work, and we need to be developing policies that are bringing men into the picture of caring and redistributing care work between the state and men. So it's not all just on women. So Parliament should be providing adequate parental leave for male MPs and develop, because one of the problems is that even if we give paid paternity leave, men don't take it up all that often. So we need Parliament needs to take a lead and develop real incentives to encourage male MPs to be active parents. There needs to be easily accessible daycare facilities at Parliament within, Parliament's a big space, and it should be available to all the workers who work within Parliament, not just MPs, because not just MPs have caring responsibilities, but all the staff will have that. And that should be something that's available to all people working within Parliament, again, as a way to lead the charge about what does it mean to have a gender-sensitive workspace. Some parliaments around the world are also working to reorganize the working hours in the working day to make sure, and just to recognize that people have caring responsibilities that they need to return to. So parliaments have rules about how late they can sit into the evening. Some also coordinate the days of sitting within Parliament around the school calendar to facilitate caring and daycare. Some don't allow voting on Mondays and Fridays, which I think, Rosie, you mentioned about having to return, and Meryl, you mentioned too, having to return to your constituency. That takes time. So if you're having to vote on Friday on something really important, run back to your constituency to see your children, take care of your elderly parents, then run back on Monday for another vote. You're working all weekend, right? So we can devise systems and allocate time in a way to facilitate people's professional responsibilities and their caring responsibilities. The second thing that we can be really, really active on is gender sensitive language. The atmosphere within parliaments is very much a gentleman's club. It's very elite. It's dominated by male voices and practices, and the language used has to change to be gender inclusive. So we have to avoid subsuming women within male terms. So chairman should become chairperson. We should be avoiding he and replacing it with gender neutral pronouns that recognize that gender is a spectrum. So we could use he or she or they. We can avoid talking and referring to people with a title that references their marital status, because again, just another way to control women. So we can use language as a way to convey that this is a space that's welcome for women. And sometimes when you talk about using gender neutral language, you get dismissed for being like a kind of fussy political correctness. But actually language is so powerful. It shapes and influences attitudes and behaviors. And it's a small, subtle thing that can have a meaningful impact to convey widely and broadly that this is a space that's welcoming to all people. And the third thing I'll talk about is sexual harassment at work. Parliament is a workspace, and we know, there's been studies that Parliament is a workspace where sexual abuse, bullying, and harassment occur. And it is imperative that Parliament then take the lead in developing laws and policies that really address sexual harassment as an issue of women's equality and human rights. Immunity from sexual harassment within Parliament just perpetuates this idea that political representatives are above the law. That if an MP sexually harasses you at work and nothing happens, it just creates this hierarchy of power and creates a feeling and a belief that women don't matter. And whatever system Parliament develops to have accountability for sexual harassment at work has to really be careful and attentive to the deep power imbalances. There are real structural power imbalances between MPs and the staff working with them, between larger staff within Parliament. So it needs to be attentive to how power works to make sure systems of accountability within Parliament are actually usable for the people who've experienced sexual harassment. It's also really important that sexual harassment be conceptualized as a breach of women's human rights. It's not just a culture, it's not just we'll take a training course. Sexual harassment is a violation of women's rights to be treated equally, and it needs to be treated and spoken as such, because this brings a gravity to the situation that it currently oftentimes doesn't have. So some positive steps that Parliament can take to really address sexual harassment at work is to clarify or even pass specific legislation that condemns sexual harassment within Parliament, or to extend equality legislation to clarify that it applies to Parliament. Currently, the Equality Act, which prohibits discrimination, MPs are not technically covered by it because they're not employed, they're elected. So they're not covered by some of the equality framework that protects us against sexual harassment. So again, just simple little legal technicalities can be fixed to make it clear that sexual harassment in Parliament is something that is condemned by law. There's lots of debates about the workplace diversity training and sexual harassment training and how effective they are. Whether Parliament does or doesn't do training, what's really important is that training shouldn't become a box-ticking exercise that alleviates the need for real structural change and for real accountability. And probably the most important thing that Parliament needs to do is to develop strong internal accountability procedures and ensure that they're supported by robust financial and human resources. So although parliamentary sovereignty means that Parliament can control its own working space and parliamentary privilege and all these ancient legal doctrines, Parliament still needs to develop an accountability procedure for sexual harassment that is meaningful, that encourages individuals who've experienced sexual harassment, no matter where they work within Parliament, no matter who has harassed them, to feel safe in coming forward and reporting harassment. And the procedures then have to protect the individual's privacy, their confidentiality, and protect them against backlash because of these power imbalances. It needs to be sensitive to how people want to resolve a circumstance of sexual harassment, not always require one fit solution. It needs to make sure that there are procedures to maybe get external investigation. Again, given the power imbalances, the importance of having sexual harassment procedures that are free of bias, that are seen as legitimate, it might be necessary to bring in outside investigators to investigate complaints of sexual harassment. And probably what's really, really key is that it has to seem to be working. If you have a sexual harassment accountability procedure or policy within Parliament and it gets known and talked about throughout the workplace that no one's ever held account for what anything ever happened, the system lacks legitimacy. So there needs to be actual accountability, actual remedy and consequences, and transparency. It can't just be performative accountability for sexual harassment. So this is a long struggle about how to make sure institutions are fair for women. Attention to sexual harassment at work, attention to women's caring roles, attention to the language spoken are really important first steps to make sure that Parliament isn't just for men, but is a workplace that is welcoming and valorizes women's lived experiences. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I mean, for really unpicking those three areas that you highlight. It definitely enriched the debate, I think, and also coming from a legal background as well. I mean, you actually listed, a series of options and ways that we could actually tackle these obstacles. It's a shame that we're still, discussing and not actually enacting them, because, I mean, a place to store breast milk, for example, shouldn't be that big of an issue. It should be something that should be easily, within a day or two be solved. But obviously, we're not there yet, unfortunately. And of course, talking about the gender sensitive language and sexual harassment at work, and looking at Parliament as a place of work, and how to tackle the culture, perhaps, not just amongst MPs, but for all those working there, I think is crucial and critical to the debate as well. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed listening and hearing from all three of our speakers. I just wanted to start the Q&A session with, perhaps, do we have questions for each other? Would anyone like to start with a question? Is that the silence? Okay.
Yeah. Rosie, I'm really interested, when you're doing survey data and talking to MPs or people who've been elected, do they want to talk, or are they a bit hesitant? Are they keen to share their experience?
I think it depends. I mean, some of the data is literally a survey. The survey that we did of MPs, we did with the support of the Speaker of the House, and so there were internal emails that went round encouraging MPs to complete it. And then some of the data was also publicly available, so we supplemented as well. And then when it comes to the qualitative work, I think, again, it just depends on the individual. There are some who are very keen and passionate about these issues and want to talk about them, and there are others who really don't.
I can add a question that we've got from the audience, which I think is an interesting one, and perhaps touches upon, Rosie, what you just said about the variety of ways in which women can attract these issues. The question is, do women, when they are in power as a political leader, do enough to make it more fair for women to follow in their footsteps? I mean, do we have any examples of perhaps leaders within Parliament who are kind of championing in this, and do you think more needs to be done from within the House to change the environment there?
I don't think we should be blaming the women. I think that when you're in a very small minority, it's often harder for women to kind of be collaborative. Although I think the very early days of women in Parliament, the women all shared a dressing room and were very collaborative across party lines. But actually, if you want to fit into an institution when you're in a minority, sometimes it's just easier to too hard to fight the battle for some people. And I think a really notable exception would be Harriet Harman, who the whole time that she's in Parliament has constantly championed these issues. And my goodness, she was treated terribly by the press when, in those early days, Harriet Har person, absolutely vilified. And I think now we're in a position where there are sufficient numbers of women MPs that it's actually safer and easier for women MPs, at least inside Parliament, to cooperate. But obviously then there's this issue about how they are sometimes attacked by individuals outside, especially on social media.
Yeah, Meryl, I think you wanted to come on.
I think thinking about the four nations of the UK, we do also have some prominent examples of women's leadership beyond Westminster, and I'm thinking particularly of Nicola Sturgeon. And in terms of women's representation, the shifts that we've seen in the Scottish National Party in terms of numbers of women in the parliamentary party, 50-50 cabinets, and also party support for gender quotas, which traditionally they lagged behind Scottish Labour on. And that's in part due to a feminist First Minister who is not afraid to say she's a feminist, and who really pushed for movement on women's representation. But it's also due to a context in Scotland where women's political mobilization, particularly around the independence referendum, where you also see a movement of women from kind of grassroots small p politics into big P parliamentary politics. So you're opening up new pathways kind of beyond the traditional ones for women to enter into politics. But I think, to echo Rosie, to come back to what I said at the end of my talk, it's not a straightforward relationship, and it depends on a lot of different things, and whether you're in power and what that situation is like, and whether you have to keep your enemies close and et cetera, in terms of who you're appointing to your cabinets, et cetera, in terms of the power dynamics. So we can't assume a straightforward outcome, but also I think we have to be wary about putting too much on women's shoulders. And particularly with the COVID pandemic, I worry that the rhetoric is women will save us from COVID, and that for these women leaders, you're facing a long period of economic recovery and recession, and that they will then be blamed for things out with their control that they were supposed to fix. We saw the similar kind of rhetoric around the financial crisis, and it is very problematic in that way, and it makes assumptions that women are naturally particular ways, when in fact it is a complicated relationship. Yeah.
And I think it's kind of seen as the responsibility of women to stick up for other women, but those MPs at the end of the day are there to do their job that they've been elected for. And it's just kind of, obviously, I mean, if it was me in that position, I think on a personal level, it would be something I would be passionate about, but to expect everyone to kind of share their time in which they may have, personal responsibilities within their own families or communities at large, to kind of champion and lead the way. I mean, it like Meghan referred to it as a human rights violation, sexual harassment. I mean, it shouldn't just be seen as a women's issue, but something that should be tackled with on a legal step as well. I'm just looking through the other questions, and one's quite interesting. How much do you think social media contributes to advancing women in politics? I mean, there've been, I think the Me Too campaign was also highlighted and used to highlight sexual harassment within Parliament and politics as well. I mean, do you have any comments on the role of social media, perhaps?
Yeah, I can go first. I think social media is so interesting because it's in some ways it's neutral, right? It can be used as a force of good. It does, when legal accountability for sexual harassment is incredibly difficult. So the failure of law kind of does help, at least in part, explain the Me Too movement, right? Okay, if we can't get legal accountability, if I can't get redress through typical legal avenues, I will go to social media and I will say what happened. So it's given another platform, and then in turn that's feeding back into legal processes, both sort of like internally within a workplace and more broadly within legal structures. So in that way, we can see social media being a really useful and powerful tool to advance gender equality. But at the same time, we can see just the vitriol piled upon any woman who puts their head up to say, I have a political opinion about something. So it's this odd space that is very, very difficult to navigate and very difficult to control. So I think using it to advance gender equality and advance women's political participation can be useful, but the downsides of it have to very much be considered.
I think in terms of what's interesting about social media too is who engages with social media and what forms of social media and what kinds of inequalities does that reinforce. And reading some work on gender and political participation, there was some interesting stuff about women are much less likely than men to use hashtags, official hashtags, and that this initially was kind of interpreted as a sign that women don't have as much political interest as men, right? They're not interested, they don't know what the hashtags are, they're not tapping into the debates. But actually, when you drill down into it, some of that is about, if you use an official hashtag, you end up, anyone can kind of see and then come after you, possibly on social media. So it's again that risk of either you're participating in a kind of more communal conversation, but you also could be opening yourself up for attacks, etc. So that it's about a kind of deliberate way of protecting yourself in some ways. So I think that's interesting as well. I think Meghan's absolutely right in terms of the kind of double-edged sword of social media.
One of the things also, this is I don't really have a lot of research on this, but it's something I've more noticed anecdotally is I'm not entirely sure that men realize the extent of the abuse women experience on social media, that their use of social media is so different that the kind of the level of hatred that can be directed towards somebody, I don't think that's well understood by men as sort of a collective. Again, I don't have a lot of data to back this up. It's just something I've noticed in talking to colleagues and you know, that part of it might be that explaining to men, I guess, to women-splain, like, this is what happens. This is what's going to happen. We have to be this to explain the lived reality of social media for women in politics.
I'm a little time conscious, and we've got 10 minutes left, so perhaps we can kind of end on another question that's been asked. The question is positive discrimination the way forward? I mean, I think it was mentioned, Rosie's mentioned it, but legal perspectives were also mentioned as well. I mean, of course, they can be incorporated into positive discrimination, and we've got the quotas and stuff in place that the Labour Party are using, you know, with this thing. But which do you think is the most effective tool to kind of overcome an obstacle? And perhaps you could identify an obstacle which you think is the largest for women, and then the best way of overcoming that.
Well, I think, you know, a quota creates a demand. I mean, there's always, I mean, this is Meryl's expertise, but there's often this kind of cry when people say, why aren't there enough women in politics? Well, there's not enough supply of women. Women don't want to do this. And yet when you create a demand by putting in a quota, suddenly all these women are found, and it can create a virtuous circle where women realise they're wanted, so they put themselves forward. And also we do know from some of the research in the US that women are less likely to kind of wake up in the mirror and look in the morning and think, I am the next, I don't know, MP for Edgbaston or whatever it is. Then it's more likely that for a woman who's equally qualified needs to be tapped on the shoulder and somebody say, you would be a great MP. Now, I don't think that makes the women, people talk about meritocracy. I really agree with John Stuart Mill. I think that's the right philosopher, that we should have politicians that don't want to be politicians. I think that we've got enough narcissistic fools on the global stage right now, and I think somebody who is actually a little bit circumspect, a little bit thoughtful about their leadership skills, asks questions about their own ability. I think that kind of humility is what we need in politics. And so if what women need sometimes is a bit of a tap on the shoulder and saying, you're doing great stuff in your community, you could really make a difference in Parliament, I bet we get better people because of that. And the quota creates an environment where there is an incentive for parties to go out and look for those women that are not all there going, me, but have got something really interesting to offer.
Yeah, just to add to Rosie there, I agree 100%. And I think what that taps into is that, at least in the UK, when we look at the empirical evidence, the problem is not women. So the problem is not women not coming forward, but the problem is that parties are not selecting women candidates, and crucially, they're not always selecting them for winnable seats, so seats that they can actually win. And then also thinking back to the figures Rosie presented at the start, we see big party imbalances still, and this explains why we're not getting to that equal representation, is because some parties are being proactive in promoting women and others are not. So what legal quotas do is they require all parties to select a certain proportion of women. And I think we have come in the UK to the point where we now have to say, we can't leave this up to the parties because they're not getting the job done. And we need to make this statutory and make this legal and require all parties to ensure equal representation.
I mean, I 100% agree. One of the things, so I'm not English, I'm Canadian. The term in England or in the UK is positive discrimination, but I disagree with that term because it's not discrimination. It's affirmative action, or it's temporary special measures, which is the language of the UN Convention on Women. It's measures to undo male privilege. It's not a lucky break women are getting. It's not a benefit. It's working to undo decades, if not centuries, of male privilege. And one of the arguments that's used to defeat quotas is like, oh, if we have quotas, we'll have to appoint these unqualified women to meet the quota, and this will do damage to our political system. But that argument entirely ignores how the definition of what is a meritorious politician, which Meryl talked about, is so deeply gendered. We assume that there are certain characteristics that what it means to be a successful politician, and we ignore the skills and qualities, which Rosie was talking about, that might actually make a really good politician. So this idea that quotas will lead to bad politicians just ignores how our idea of what a good politician is so tied up into the male norm. And sort of lastly, why I think statutory protection of quotas, we recognize that women have a right to be treated equally. And yet we are constantly telling women they have to wait to enjoy that equality. You have to wait another 100 years for your equal pay. You have to wait another 100 years until you get equal political participation. And I think we have to be firm and say, no, enough is enough. We're not waiting to enjoy our equality. We're going to be using positive measures to enjoy our right to equality in the present moment.
Definitely. Wow, I feel empowered and angered and motivated and enlightened to continue with the work that I'm volunteering in, and also in larger society that needs to be done. So thank you, Rosie, Meryl, and Meghan, for your contributions, your presentations today. I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience will feels the same and thinks the same. So thank you very much for being here with us tonight, and I hope the debate continues further, as I'm sure it will. Yeah, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.